Welcome to the Low Carb Cardiologist Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brett Scher, and I am the Low Carb Cardiologist. We're here to be your source for reliable and practical information to help you improve your health and your life. We're going to help you make sense of the controversy, we're going to dive into the science, and show you practical tips about how you can improve your health and your life today. So I'm glad you're here, and I can't wait to get started with the Low Carb Cardiologist Podcast. Welcome back to the Low Carb Cardiologist Podcast, episode number 36. Today I'm joined by Tucker Goodrich. Now, if you haven't heard of Tucker Goodrich, you have to put him on your list of outstanding citizen scientists, up there in the realms of the Dave Feldmans, Siobhan Huggins, and Ivor Cummins, all who have been on this podcast before. Now, Tucker is actually a technology executive in the financial industry, and he designs, runs, and debugs complex systems, which means he's a professional problem solver. But he had to turn this technology problem solving into problem solving for his own health. He was riddled with multiple medical problems, including stroke-like symptoms. He didn't have an actual stroke, it sounds like, but stroke-like symptoms, which are obviously very scary, plus irritable bowel, diverticulitis, colon surgery. So he had to use his problem-solving skills to figure out why all this was happening. And he came out with the two likely culprits that happen time and time again: wheat and omega-6 seed oils. Now, in a way, he's lucky because he had these dramatic symptoms, so he could tell something was wrong, could problem solve it, and find out what was wrong. But for most people, if they have a reaction to these seed oils or to wheat, it might be a little more subtle, or they might not have any reactions at all. And as you'll hear Tucker say, when it comes to these omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid seed oils, that can be dangerous because if you're not having any symptoms and you're consuming these on a regular basis, you may be putting yourself at risk. They have been linked to increased inflammation, increased oxidation, possibly even cancer, dementia, cardiovascular disease, yet they're hailed as healthy because they decrease LDL. So we're going to talk about that, about how decreasing LDL doesn't always mean healthy. We're going to talk about the byproducts and their health risk. And just as a reminder here, a review, these omega-6 seed oils we're talking about are the safflower oils, the soybean oil, the sunflower oil, the cottonseed oil, the most commonly used oils for cooking and in salad dressing and other hidden sources. So hopefully this podcast and the information Tucker provides is going to be eye-opening as to why and how we can try to start avoiding these omega-6 seed oils. So enjoy my interview with Tucker Goodrich. Before we get to the interview, a quick word about Oura Ring, OuraRing.com, Oura Ring. Oura Ring is my favorite sleep monitor. Not only does it tell you duration of sleep, but by using heart rate variability and other technologies, it can actually give you an accurate assessment of your sleep stages. How much time did you spend in deep sleep versus light sleep? And I think that's so important because when we talk about making changes to our sleep hygiene, we want to do whatever we can to help us sleep better. And that doesn't just mean time in bed. That means the quality of our sleep. And Oura Ring is the best that I've found at being able to quantitate that. So if you want to know if having that glass of alcohol affects your sleep, or going to bed a little earlier or a little later, or what kind of food intake, or whatever changes you're making, you will know how that affects your sleep. In addition, I'm always a little worried about the electromagnetic fields and being exposed to constant radiation. So if you're sleeping with something close to your head for 7 or 8 hours transmitting electronic waves, I'm not a fan of that. So one of the great things about the Oura Ring is it collects the information without transmitting until you tell it to. So it's basically off. It's not transmitting at all while you're sleeping. You wake up, you tell it to transmit, and then it does. So it doesn't expose you to potentially harmful electromagnetic fields and radiation. So if you're interested, check it out, OuraRing.com. Use the promo code LowCarbCardiologist at checkout to save $50 off your purchase price. All right, enough from our sponsor. Now let's get back to the interview with Tucker Goodrich. Tucker Goodrich, thank you so much for joining me on the Low Carb Cardiologist Podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing very well, Brett. It's a pleasure to be here talking to you today. Thank you very much for asking me.
Yeah, well, it's absolutely my pleasure to have you because you're like one of my favorite groups of people, these citizen scientists who are taking it upon themselves to turn the literature inside out and know it better than any of the other scientists or physicians or healthcare providers. I mean, the the way that you and people like Siobhan Huggins and Dave Feldman and Ivor Cummins and others have been able to dissect the literature and come out with so many great little tips and nuances and different ways to look at it that we all need to sort of wake up to has been phenomenal. So first of all, just thank you for being part of that.
Flattered that you put me in that company. It's a very intelligent crowd of people. I hope I deserve it.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, and your story is also fascinating. So give us a little background. I mean, I guess maybe I should give the background I know, and you can sort of fill in a little bit. I mean, you started off as basically a professional problem fixer on Wall Street, and that was your job. When problems came up, you were the guy to figure out how to fix it, which sort of plays in perfectly within the problems you had with your health, and you became a problem fixer for your health, and now you're trying to become a problem fixer for the issues of society and chronic diseases. I mean, is that sort of an accurate, quick summary?
That is, yeah, that's pretty much it in a nutshell. The problem solver part is key. I had a background in Wall Street starting off as a financial advisor and kind of got roped into the computer side of the business. And it was typically there was some sort of a business problem that we needed to solve, and typically involving a lot of manual labor, which I was desperate to avoid.
Yeah.
So I would figure out some way programmatically for me personally to avoid having to do all that manual labor, and then kind of got good at it. And it just kept scaling up. It was one of those career paths that when people have asked me in the past, so how did you get to where you are today? And my short answer is, I'm not really sure. I'm trying to figure that out.
Yeah.
It was just like, and it wound up with my being the chief technology officer for a large New York hedge fund complex with a team of computer scientists and system engineers working under me on systems that I had designed and managed.
Now, are you still involved in that world, or have you sort of transitioned over full time to health information?
No, I'm still very much involved in that world. Although I would like to, when I got into this, I realized pretty quickly that even somebody like myself who didn't have any sort of medical background or dietitian training could, through the stuff I was reading in the literature, still help people have a huge impact on their lives. One of my colleagues was a 30-odd year diabetic, and when I started explaining to him some of the stuff that I had been reading, and entirely by chance, we had a colleague in the same office whose son was a type 1 diabetic who was seeing Dr. Bernstein.
Oh, wow.
And we were able to help this fellow fix his diet, stop a lot of the progression that he was seeing in his diabetes, and even start to reverse some of the nastier symptoms. Like he was, regularly going in to have surgery on his jaw to affect the necrosis that he was seeing there.
Oh,
and we realized that he had 3 occluded arteries and wound up having a quadruple bypass right off the bat.
Yeah.
But over the course, he healed like a normal person, not like a diabetic, as his doctors said. Mm-hmm. And he was able to see some regression of his atherosclerosis over the years. Yeah. So Amazing. It had a huge impact on this guy who had been diabetic for decades.
Without MD or PhD after your name, some people would say, that can't happen. That's not right. But no, it happens. And you're living proof of that.
He was an engineer, so we would sit down and we would have engineering discussions of the sort we would have professionally. Here's the problem, here's the pathway, and just go through the entire chain of events. And when you start looking at it that way, which is the same thing that Ivor does, for instance, or Dave Feldman, they both have similar backgrounds to mine.
Right.
And that perspective kind of allows us to get around some of the problems that I think the medicine and the scientific medical literature has, where people are so siloed that, you talk to guys and they're like, oh, I'm studying X. And you're like, okay, well, Y causes X. Have you looked at Y? No, I study X. And it's kind of like, okay. Well,
right.
And in my world, that's just not an answer. If you're a developer and if you're a software developer and you realize you have a hardware problem, it's often not feasible where you can just point the finger at the hardware guys. At the very least, you have to sit down and figure out how to resolve the problem for the company, or you both get fired.
It's all interrelated. It's all interconnected, just like our bodies and our lifestyle and our environment and all our systems. We don't just have a kidney system. We don't just have a pulmonary system or a cardiac system. They're all interrelated, and we have to look at it like an engineered machine, which is basically how you guys look at it, and that's awesome.
Right. So we look at it, to put it formally, we look at it from a systems engineering perspective.
Yeah, but before you could help other people with your systems engineering perspective, you had to help yourself. I mean, you definitely had your own health challenges and amazing stories of ending up in a stroke ward with stroke-like symptoms that people couldn't figure out, and having digestive issues for years, culminating in diverticulitis, a perforation of little outpouching of your colon, and having part of your colon removed. And then finally, as I've heard you say it, finding the trigger, which for you seemed to be the omega-6 seed oils, removing those and everything resolving. I mean, that is an incredible story.
Yeah, it was my two major triggers are omega-6 oils and wheat. It was wheat that put me in the stroke ward.
Yeah.
And I learned afterwards. And now, I can get those symptoms back if I make a mistake in my diet and eat something with even trace amounts of wheat. So that's obviously something I desperately try to avoid doing.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, with your experimental mind, have you been sadistic enough to purposely do that to see if you trigger the symptoms again, to see if it's still there?
Oh, yeah. At the beginning, because, at the beginning, I didn't really know what the exposures were. I looked into processed food, like, beer is a processed food. And I figured out pretty quickly that wheat was a problem. So then I tried stuff like sourdough bread, which I'd heard some people with wheat sensitivities can eat. That didn't work. Beer, I was a big fan of beer. And I distinctly remember the last bottle of beer I had, which was a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, which left me writhing in agony throughout the night. So that was the end of that.
Oh, boy.
And some of it was just, dumb luck. Like, I discovered that most soy sauce has wheat in it by getting some sushi at a Whole Foods and winding up doubled over in pain with stomach cramps, and then went back into the supermarket to figure out, why did that happen, and read through the lengthy list of ingredients and got to wheat and soy sauce. Oops.
Yeah, so you had to be very proactive and very detailed to figure a lot of this out. But in a way, I almost see it like the severity of your symptoms, and I hate to sound callous by saying this, but it sort of makes you lucky, because it can be a very clear reaction, whereas there are probably thousands or hundreds of thousands of people out there having sort of subclinical reactions to foods, just kind of feeling a little tired, feeling a little bloated, feeling a little inflamed, not feeling quite right. And maybe it doesn't reach their threshold to say, boy, I've really got to figure this out and dissect this out. But for you, it was clear cut. So in a way, it made it a little bit easier for you to say something has to happen. Now, I'm sure it was a challenge to figure out, exactly what it was.
You're absolutely right. It makes it easier for me. And I am lucky that it's so extreme, because it makes compliance very simple.
Yeah.
And my daughters, for instance, who have similar issues but don't have the extreme the acute reaction that I do, have a rougher time of it, because it takes them, we can get their symptoms to resolve, but then they don't come back immediately. So they can say, oh, well, I can eat a cake and I'll feel fine.
Right.
Whereas I know if I touch a cake, I'm going to be feeling horrible immediately and perhaps not be able to drive home because I can't see anymore. So it can be a problem.
Right. So you're definitely an outlier in terms of your symptoms. So the majority of the people are going to have much more milder symptoms. And that's what creates the challenge in our society. But still, although, probably,
diverticulitis affects, I think, 80% of Americans by the time they're 80 years old, and that's clearly diet related. So,
is it that high? 80%? Wow.
Yeah, it's very high, which is why, we all see all those Metamucil ads.
Yeah, right.
That's the typical prescription for it. So, so you're right. You're absolutely right. I mean, it does sound a little callous, but I say it to myself that you're very lucky that that I figured this out, and B, that the effects are extreme enough so that I'm forced to be very compliant. It makes, and it means I feel great all the time. It's not a bad thing.
That's good. So how'd you transition from learning that wheat was a problem to learning that the seed oils were a problem?
Well, it actually came about the other way around. I got into the whole, so let me just back up. I grew up with, my mother had weight problems and was constantly looking into different kinds of diets like Weight Watchers or whatever, right? So I grew up with this impression that all of this diet stuff was baloney because it didn't work for her, right? And, which is the conclusion that most of the medical profession comes to, right? You see people try this stuff and you see them fail at it and you come to the conclusion, okay, it just doesn't work. And that was the conclusion that I had come to. And somebody sent me a link to Stefan Guillenet's blog, Whole Health Source. And one of the other health issues that my family had was bad teeth, right? Cavities and malocclusion. Teeth don't come in straight. So I hate dentists and had to spend a lot of time in the dentist chair getting cavities filled and teeth pulled. And my mother had bad teeth and her mother had bad teeth, so I just assumed it was genetic. And then I read this post that Stefan did that laid out how poor teeth are entirely 100% the result of diet. There's no genetic component to it. And he demonstrated this by going through a bunch of different populations and showing how on adopting an industrial diet, and I can define that later, they went from perfect teeth to horrible teeth in a single generation universally across the population. And that absolutely blew my mind.
Yeah.
The fact that all the stuff I'd gone through, then optional, essentially, opened up my eyes that this could have a real effect. And then I started reading his blog, and he went over a lot of the problems with seed oils. And one day I went down to the cafeteria at work and made myself a salad, because I ate to the food pyramid, basically. I referred to myself as Mr. Whole Wheat, which is hilarious now in hindsight.
Yeah, right.
And, I'd eat lots of salads. And so I went down to the salad bar and I put a salad together, and I got to the end and I looked at the collection of dressings there and I thought to myself, you know what? These have got to be cheapest oils that you can put in a squeeze bottle. And I sat there for a couple of minutes thinking of all the things that he'd written about. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to cut these out and see what happens. Now, at that point, I had irritable/inflammatory bowel disease for 16 years. This was 2 years past having to have a colon resection for acute diverticulitis. So, not to get into too much information about it, but I had basically had chronic diarrhea for 16 years at this point.
That doesn't sound like fun.
And no, it's not fun. Having to travel everywhere with a roll of toilet paper is not fun. And so, this was Friday or Thursday, whatever. So I made the salad dry with some vinegar in it. 2 days later, my diarrhea went away. 2 days. And I've gone back and I've looked at the email I sent to Stefan after that, and I was absolutely blown away that it was fixed. And now what was interesting was what else happened. I hadn't, being a good experimentalist, you change one variable at a time. I tried going low carb a couple of times before because, like most Americans, I was putting on about a pound a year. I was never obese, but I was, my middle was expanding, the typical drill.
Right.
So I tried going low carb before, and I was never able to get around the carbohydrate cravings that I would experience. So I just figured it didn't work for me. But what I realized, the carbohydrate cravings went away also. And I basically forgot to eat any carbohydrates for a week until the following week when I got myself a sandwich with whole wheat bread, of course, because that's what you're supposed to eat.
Right.
And found myself having a horrible reaction to it.
Yeah.
At which point he had also talked about that. And I was like, come on, that's crazy. Wheat can't be bad for people. I mean, look at me. I'm healthy. Haha. And I'm Mr. Whole Wheat. So how can it be bad for you? Right. And yeah, lo and behold, I'm discovered in short order that I was one of the more severely gluten intolerant people I've ever heard of.
Well, and so that's one of the things that I find interesting about this combination of sort of wheat, gluten, and omega-6 seed oil intolerance, because so often in the standard American diet, they are combined. And that's what can make it challenging to figure out which one is your issue, because some people may have issues with both, some may have issues with one or the other. But I think it's pretty clear that regardless, neither one is all that helpful. But I wanted to find some things with you about omega-6 oils, seed oils, because omega-6 fatty acids are something we need. They're what's called an essential fatty acid. Our bodies can't make them, so we need to take them in. So where does the problem lie? I'm sort of leading the question here. Where does the problem lie with, or where's the differentiating factor between needing them and having toxicity from them?
Well, it's whether or not they're actually essential is kind of a question, but it's kind of a moot point because all whole foods have omega-6 fats in them, right? They are produced like omega-6 fats and omega-3 fats are both ultimately produced by plants, and then they aggregate up the food chain, right? So, you get omega-3 in a fish because it's made in algae, which is a plant basically, and the fish eats lots of algae and it concentrates the omega-3 fats in its tissues, and then it gets eaten by something like a salmon, and then we eat it, right? Omega-6 fats, same thing in plants, on land more. So, yeah, it's very important to make, and I'm glad you made this point up front. You don't want to cut omega-6 fats entirely out of your diet, and it's probably impossible to do it outside of a lab. So don't worry about that part of it, right? I mean, I hate seeing people people tend to go to extremes with diet stuff. Right. And it's like, my analogy is too much water can kill you. It causes hyponatremia potentially, but that doesn't imply that you shouldn't drink any water.
Excellent analogy.
Because that will also kill you. Right.
Yeah. So omega-6s can be found in nuts and seeds and flax seeds and hemp seeds and things that are traditionally thought of as helpful and good additives. So you're saying those don't necessarily have to be avoided. Is that accurate?
No, and that's exactly right. I think with nuts especially, you've got to be mindful that, let me back up a little bit, right? When you're looking, basically every dietary component has what you call a U-curve or a J-shaped curve, right? Where too little of it causes ill health and too much of it causes ill health, right? That's true for water, oxygen, everything else. Omega-6 fats seem to be the same, right? Too little, or polyunsaturated fats, too little causes deficiencies, and too much is probably also going to cause a problem. It makes sense. It's true for everything.
Right.
And we can go into what the too much starts looking like and how we know that it's too much in humans. Stuff like nuts are so what you're looking for is a moderate intake, but the hard part is figuring out what does moderate mean, right? So if you look at something like nuts, a moderate intake of nuts, well, nuts are seasonal, right? What we evolved for is nuts are a seasonal crop. They're hard to get at. Michael Eads wrote a great post about this called Are Nuts Paleo? And he compares how easy it is to get nuts at the supermarket versus he grew up harvesting walnuts and had to use a pickup truck to break the shells.
Oh, wow.
So he's like, okay, if you're going to eat the amount of nuts that it would, it's two entirely different amounts of food that you're going to be getting if you have to harvest nuts yourself by hand,
right?
Or if you're going to go back buy bags of it at the supermarket. So what I say to people is, nuts are fine. Don't make them a staple. Don't eat them all the time because we couldn't eat them all the time. And I think that starts getting into the too much area.
Yeah, I love that study that looked at moderation, sort of eating in moderation in general, and they found people defined moderation basically by whatever they were eating at that time. Like everybody felt like they were eating, and we're completely different from one person to the other. But whatever you're doing, that's your definition of moderation. So it's a very difficult thing to define for most people.
Right.
So so when you brought up the paleo and sort of the ancestral way of looking at nutrition, which I think is so helpful and important. And in those times, all the omega-6s came from real foods, from fish that were eating other fish, from land animals that were eating the plants. But then we evolved into this ability to make sort of what I call fake food omega-6s, all the seed oils. So walk us through a little bit of that history, because I've heard you talk about it before, and it's such an interesting transition that we got from sort of the real omega-6s to these highly concentrated, really no point in history have they existed before omega-6 oils. Yeah,
so omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids, if you're looking at somebody who was eating a Paleolithic diet, a real caveman eating a Paleolithic diet, he'd be eating grass-fed animals because they're wild. Right. And they're running around, and he'd probably have the occasional fish and some nuts when he could get them, And if you're eating a diet like that, you don't have to have a conversation about this topic because you're eating what we evolved to eat in the quantities we evolved to eat it. When getting into this, gosh, I remember, you hear people in the diet world say some things that sound a little crazy, like, oh, they're feeding us industrial waste, blah, blah, blah. Well, it turns out in this case, it was literally industrial waste originally, right? With cottonseed oil is where, as far as I've been able to find, the wholesale consumption of omega-6 rich fats started from American cotton production. Cottonseed oil was a waste product, and they would throw it away, right? Then they figured out because it's actually toxic, then they figured out how to detoxify it. And first step was they started adulterating lard with it, right? People didn't want to buy the stuff, but people bought lard, and you could blend in cottonseed oil with lard, and people couldn't tell the difference. So they started adulterating it, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons why we have an FDA is because people would do stuff like this, right? And then after a while, there became, at one point they figured out somebody tried to I read a piece about somebody trying to corner the lard market, and they figured out that 30% of the lard that was on the market wasn't lard because there weren't enough pigs in the country to produce it.
Oh, wow. And
that's when they started realizing how significant the adulteration problem had gotten.
Yeah.
So then they started saying, okay, and if you go back and you read a lot of these early accounts of probably one of the worst is, the American Indians, after the buffalo were all killed and they were driven off their lands, they would be given by the government wheat flour and lard. And at the time, that's when the lard was adulterated. And they would make fry bread, which was basically they're living on pancakes all day long.
Yeah.
And that had a horrible effect on their health.
Gee, I wonder how that could be.
Yes, exactly. So that sort of stuff goes right back to the beginning of omega-6 production. Then a German chemist came up with this bright idea of hydrogenating polyunsaturated fatty acids, which I'll call PUFAs for short for the rest. So basically what hydrogenating a PUFA does is it adds a couple of hydrogen atoms into the molecule so that it becomes saturated with hydrogen, right? Unsaturated means it has a couple of missing hydrogen atoms. Saturated means it's fully solid. A PUFA fat is an oil at room temperature. A saturated fat is a solid at room temperature, right? Like a bar of soap is mostly saturated fats, or tallow if you get good grade tallow. I used to have to use a chisel to get the tallow out of my tallow tub.
Yeah.
Because it was literally the consistency of a bar of soap.
Yeah.
And therefore, it's extremely stable. It doesn't oxidize, doesn't need to be refrigerated.
And I think that's the key component to get to is how these oils sort of never meant to exist in the way they exist, in the process of extracting them and making them and trying to maintain them just predisposes them to oxidation and what that does to our body. So tell us about the oxidation.
Yeah, so oxidation is the process of the fats combining with oxygen and being broken down into what they call peroxidation products, right? This is why a fish goes rancid.
Right.
It's the omega-6 fats in the fish breaking down into these rancid fat products, right? I mean, we don't read much about it nowadays, but it used to be food going rancid was a problem because it meant you had to throw it out. You couldn't eat it anymore. Now with refrigeration and everything, it's not such an issue. The rancid fats can be toxins in the right amount, right? Some of them are exceedingly toxic to kind of, the most extreme example I have heard of this is in China. The leading cause of lung cancer amongst non-smoking women is cooking with polyunsaturated fats because they break down into the same toxins that one finds in cigarette smoke.
Wow. So
they have all these people over there who are coming down with lung cancer and had never smoked. They couldn't figure it out. And it turns out if you cook with seed oils in an enclosed space, you are inhaling the same toxins that cause lung cancer for a smoker.
So that was in Asia, but that's not been shown to be the case here, or hasn't been reported here in the United States?
It's better kitchen conditions. It causes other problems in our industrial kitchens. They have problems with gumming. I mean, what's it called? Flaxseed oil, linseed oil is what you use to make varnish on furniture. But that's a polyunsaturated fat that, as it breaks down, turns into varnish, right?
Yeah.
When you cook with seed oils in the kitchen, the same process happens, and you wind up with this thick, varnishy gum all over the kitchen. And it's a big problem to clean, and it's a big problem. They've had laundry bags burst into flames because these products are so unstable, they auto-oxidize in the air, and they can actually cause, like the uniforms, if you pile them all in a truck on a hot day, to burst into flames.
It's stories like these that are just incredible, though. And then, like, why would people still think it's a good idea to use these in our food? How does that? That's a dissonance that just seems crazy, that people can acknowledge that they cause to burst into flames and that they cake on everything, and yet we're still going to use it in our food and put it in our bodies. So how does that transition happen?
That gets back to one of the favorite topics of the cardiology profession, which is cholesterol.
Right.
It's been known for quite a long time, I would guess since maybe the 50s or 40s, that polyunsaturated fat intake lowers blood cholesterol quite effectively.
Right.
And there have been a number of interventional studies where they've tested this, and it's, we can go into that. That's a long story we can go into at some point, but it clearly lowers blood cholesterol. So if you are convinced, as much of the cardiology profession is, that cholesterol causes heart disease, and you have this seemingly natural food that lowers it, they've come to the conclusion, okay, you should eat these fatty acids because it lowers your cholesterol. So that's the logic behind it.
And those studies drive me crazy that say, if you use the PUFAs and you reduce your LDL by X amount, then you get X amount reduction in your risk of heart disease. And that's one of those transitive property math problems that don't hold up. If in some circumstances lowering LDL reduces heart disease, then in a completely different circumstance, lowering LDL must also equal reducing heart disease. And it's just not true. And so I'm sure you're well versed in the Minnesota coronary experiment and the
Yes.
Sydney heart study. So tell us how those differ from the common knowledge of PUFAs reducing LDL and reducing heart disease risk.
Well, as you said, they said, we quote unquote know that cholesterol causes heart disease based on some bad science we realized was bad science at the time. But they didn't know that back then. And so they did a couple of studies where they gave different groups of people different diets, one that had more polyunsaturated fat, one that did not. One of them, the Minnesota trial, was done by Ansel Keys, who was the father of the diet heart hypothesis, which basically his theory was that increased saturated fat increases blood cholesterol, which is true in some cases, and that would therefore cause increased heart disease because they thought cholesterol caused heart disease. So there were two studies where they basically both did the same thing. They said, let's give people vegetable oils and see what it does to their blood cholesterol. And it went down, and they declared victory. Yay, look, it's gone down. We've proved, since we know cholesterol causes heart disease, that it's good. What they didn't do, so then along comes this fellow, Christopher Ramsden. He's got an interesting story. He comes out of the alcohol research field, and it turns out that there's an interrelation between alcoholism and polyunsaturated fatty acids, which we can get into later. So he came up with this bright idea. What they didn't show in these two studies was what the seed oil consumption did for all-cause mortality. Right? Now, this, just to quickly go over the logic of this, if you have an intervention that, say, reduces your heart disease risk but increases your cancer risk, you may see that there is no change in all-cause mortality. Now, I like to think of myself as a educated patient here, right? We as patients care about our all-cause mortality. A cardiologist may say, well, I've reduced your risk of heart disease, therefore I'm doing a good job because the heart is my problem.
Right.
And his neighbor, the oncologist, is saying, no, I don't want to see those people, right? Patients want lower all-cause mortality. So Ramsden came up with the bright idea of going back and looking at the results of these two studies and seeing what actually happened with the all-cause mortality. And it turns out, clearly in the Sydney study, not so clearly in Minnesota, that it went up when they gave them more seed oils.
clearly did
which
not
is a
go
bit of
down
a problem.
and actually went
Right.
up. Yeah.
And actually went up. Which now that we know that, and given some other research that's been done since those studies were done, makes perfect sense. So maybe it would make sense just to kind of give a little context of how I've looked at this cardiology issue. The cardiology profession is basically looking at how to treat cardiology in patients. So they're looking at it in a context of we have a patient population, approximately half of whom are going to get and or die of heart disease. How can we treat these people, right? How can we lower their risk from 50% to something less than that, right?
Right.
What I've got a history background, and the first thing I do whenever I start researching a field is start going back and looking at the history of the field so I can understand the context. Well, if you do that, you start coming across these papers where they look at populations of people who have zero heart disease. And that brings the next obvious question. Well, wait a minute. If they have zero heart disease and we don't, what changed?
Right.
Why did we go from, in the UK in the middle of the 20th century, their heart disease rate went up 70-fold? How does that happen, right? From a systems analysis standpoint, it rules out a couple of things, right? Looking at LDL, if you're claiming LDL cholesterol causes heart disease, essentially what you're saying is that heart disease is therefore a genetic disease because LDL is something that is innate in all people, right? So if LDL cholesterol, which causes, it's like saying, teeth cause cavities. If teeth cause cavities, then everybody should have cavities. But we know that's not true. Not everybody gets cavities, even though everybody has teeth. So if LDL cholesterol causes heart disease, then heart disease should appear everywhere at some level. And that's not true. We have very detailed studies where they've gone back and compared genetically similar groups inside the United States and outside the United States. And they find that the groups outside the United States have near zero rates of myocardial infarction, heart attack, which is what everybody really cares about. Back to the patient's perspective, you don't care if you have atherosclerosis.
Right.
What you care about is if it kills you. Right? That's why people started worrying about atherosclerosis in the first place, because they said, hey, you get atherosclerosis, your risk of having a heart attack and dying goes up. Right. So if you look at it that way and you start looking at these groups of people, so they looked at the Japanese, Koreans, and Africans. And those three groups in their native countries, based on autopsy data, had near zero rates of myocardial infarction. And in the United States, they were similar rates to what you would see with, white Americans. So genetic ruled out, right? Since LDL is controlled by genes, that also necessarily rules out LDL being able to cause heart disease independently, cause cavities. It may be a part of the process. Teeth are certainly involved in cavities, and LDL is certainly, we now realize, involved in heart disease, but it can't be the cause.
Right.
Or else these people, the Japanese who had near zero rates of heart disease and were an advanced industrial country, wouldn't move to America and suddenly get heart disease. Their genes haven't changed. Right. Their LDL hasn't changed.
And same for cancers too. I mean, when the fast food joints and the westernization of Japan, or when they came over here and moved to our country, their cancer rates increased as well as their cardiovascular disease risk increased. So, but when you talk about populations who seem to be protected or certainly doing better, everybody likes to talk about the blue zones. And one of the things that's frequently brought up about the blue zone, so just a quick reminder, those are the areas of the world where people tend to live in to be late 90s or 100s far more often than other parts of the world. They like to point out they eat plenty of whole grains, they eat plenty of wheat, and they probably have a fair amount of omega-6 seed oils. Is that fair that they were eating omega-6 seed oils?
That's not fair.
Okay.
The poster children of the blue zones were the inhabitants of the island of Okinawa in Japan. The Okinawans primarily ate yams with some rice, right? Rice is a high omega-6 grain when it's brown, but the Japanese don't eat brown rice. They take the bran off with the omega-6 fats because those go rancid easily and ruin the rice crop. That's why they do that, right?
Right.
And then they eat basically starch pellets, which have extremely low omega-6 fats, right? So they're eating yams, which are low in omega-6, and some rice, which is low in omega-6. They're eating a lot of... So, yeah, that's not exactly true. And they were, at the time the Blue Zones concept came up, they were the longest lived group of people in the world, right? Okay, so that's fine. So what happened to the Okinawans? World War II happened. The Americans set up a base on Okinawa to manage Japan from after World War II. And the Americans decided that they didn't like the Okinawan diet of pork, fish, rice, and yams and lots of vegetables. So they started bringing in American fast food restaurants. First American fast food restaurant in Japan was opened in Okinawa 9 years before one was opened in Tokyo to feed American soldiers. And the Okinawans, like everybody else on the planet, loved American fast food. One of its greatest qualities is that everybody loves to eat it.
Right.
So what happened to the Okinawans? The Okinawans went from the longest life expectancy to the shortest life expectancy in Japan in a single generation. Parents were burying their children, and the children were getting obese, their cancer rates went up, and their heart disease rates went up.
Yeah, devastating change in just such a short time.
Right. So there's a Japanese scientist whose name, if I remember correctly, is Okuyama, who wrote a paper talking about the excess linoleic acid syndrome in Okinawa, trying to explain what had changed in Okinawa that was killing so many Okinawans so quickly. And linoleic acid is the primary omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid in the diet. And that's what makes a seed oil, basically, is that it has large quantities of that fat. So he blamed it on, this paper I think was written in 1996, he blamed the change in the diet and the effects that happened from the change in the diet on that. Now, that's a fascinating example. It's a fascinating experiment because their genetics didn't change. Their environment didn't change. They stayed on the same island.
Right.
All that changed was the food that was brought in and fed to them. And all of a sudden, they all got sick.
Yeah.
The same way that everybody else who starts eating a lot of American food gets sick. Obesity, diabetes, cancer, and heart disease.
So can you point to any society, any population that does have a higher percentage of omega-6s and still maintains good health?
There's none that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to be you can get into some interesting variables. Having a low-fat diet like Japan or India and having an increased omega-6 fatty acid intake seems to, they don't get, the Indians and the Japanese don't get obese the way Westerners do if they're in their native countries.
Right.
And it's probably because they're on a low-fat, high-starch diet. But just even in those populations, shifting to an increased omega-6 fat has been accompanied with increased rates of diabetes and heart disease and cancer. What in Japan, they call them the Western cancers because they're the ones that started after the American occupation.
Really? They call them the Western cancers. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
And they explicitly blame it on Americans because we went in and actively promoted an increased seed oil consumption over there, which was not part of the traditional diet. And of course, like everybody else on Earth, they developed a taste for American fast food. Right.
So now you personally have had to navigate this minefield of omega-6s being everywhere. What have you learned that you can share with our listeners as to sort of the hardest places to avoid them, the most common places to avoid them, your top tips for avoiding them? What do you recommend and teach to people?
It's known as the Pareto principle, right? What are the low-hanging fruit of, if you're trying to solve a problem, you want to figure out what's the biggest bang for the buck, right? So salad dressings are almost always soybean oil, which is high in omega-6 fats. I've only found over the years a single salad dressing that was actually made with olive oil. Mayonnaise is typically made with soybean oil. soybean oil, to get back to some of the, we've talked a lot of epidemiology, but just to and epidemiology, as we all know, doesn't really show cause and effect. Since the 1960s, doctors have been treating people who have severe digestive problems with what's known as parenteral nutrition, which is where they basically inject nutrition into your veins because, for instance, you either have your gut's not fully developed if you're a baby, or if you're a transplant patient and you've had your small intestine removed.
Or a lot of people with acute pancreatitis, or who are acutely ill in the intensive care unit and whose guts have shut down, then we feed them nutrition through their veins with parenteral nutrition.
Right. And you get into, you can't feed them too much carbohydrate because it causes their veins to rot and break down from the inside out. So you have to feed them primarily fat diet, which is kind of interesting to think that what you have to feed a person intravenously is basically the reverse of what we tell them to put in their mouth. Unfortunately, they use primarily a soybean oil-based food called intralipid. Now, intralipid has a rather charming side effect, is that it rapidly induces liver failure. So they get fatty liver, steatosis, which means just fat in the liver. They get cirrhosis, and then they tend to die of hepatic cancer. And they have been feeding this to humans for, since the 1960s.
Yeah.
So we have a fairly extensive literature in real life of what happens when you feed people lots of seed oils. Not everybody, but a lot of them, a high percentage of them are killed by it. The fix is they reduce the proportion of omega-6 fats in the fat that they are feeding them. They are starting to, if they use a fish oil emulsion, it immediately reverses the liver failure, assuming it hasn't gotten too far. And I've seen pictures of, human babies fed on intralipid who are yellow with jaundice from liver failure, and then they switch them over to the fish oil emulsion, and they're perfectly healthy and pink.
Interesting.
For this particular baby in fairly short order.
Yeah.
So it's, one can discuss the pros and cons of a lot of this stuff, but the fundamental effect of too much of these fats in humans is quite clear.
So how does somebody learn if they're getting too much fats, too much omega-6s in their body, in their diet?
That is an interesting question. I mean, if you're like me, and if you have irritable bowel disease for years and you go off it and it gets better in 2 days, well then bingo, right?
Yeah.
Probably if there's, this one really blows people away. If there's anything that's going to make people sit up and pay attention to this, it's what happens to people with sunburn. So I read about this before I actually started fixing my diet. Some guy said he went on the paleo diet and he, didn't get sunburn anymore. And I was like, okay, that's nice. Figured it was another crazy dietary thing. And there are lots of crazy dietary things you learn when navigating this area.
Right.
People will tell you stuff
right.
where you're just like, no.
and I got to say, the sunburn is one that at first I was hesitant to too, because I heard you mention that when you eliminated the omega-6s, you did not burn anymore. And you are the fair skinned type of person who would burn very easily. And I thought that can't be true. Come on. But then I heard it coming from other people and I saw other things written about it. And all of a sudden it's like, maybe there's something to that. And I was pretty impressed by hearing you say that.
Yeah. So that just to, so shortly after I removed seed oils from my diet, I went skiing in March and it was a sunny day and I came down off the mountain at the end of the day. I hate sunscreen, so I virtually never use it. And the next morning, I looked in the mirror and I was like, wow, I don't have any kind of a burn. But, it wasn't like a dramatic situation. So I just kind of was like, interesting.
Yeah.
And probably 3 weeks later, I went into this event in New York City with my ex-wife, who is Colombian and dark-skinned. And I am blonde, blue-eyed, fair-haired. And I would burn, my lack of my sun sensitivity was a big issue because she was a beach person.
Yeah.
Goes to the pot, only extremely unwillingly, and I would burn in 45 minutes. So we went to this event outside and stood there side by side in the sun for 2.5 hours. And we got home at the end of the day, and she turned to me and she said, look at the sunburn I got. And her chest was all pink. And I turned to her and I said, look, I didn't burn. And it was just side by side, two people, eating the same food, except she hadn't gone on the diet yet. And it just blew us away. And since then, this is not magic, right? If you are in the sun for too long, you will burn. And I have burned in the sun. But my tolerance level has gone from 45 minutes to 6 or 7 hours. So
that's impressive.
I moved down to tech. Yeah, it's remarkable. And I was out doing a race last week and, was wearing a tank top shirt and running around, and I got a little bit of burn on the back of my neck and after hours out in the sun and no peeling. Woke up the next morning, no pain. So I got to the limit. I pushed it to the limit as far as I could go.
Yeah.
But still, no peeling on the back of my neck. I moved down to Texas for a year, never used sunscreen down there, would go out for runs 3 or 4 hours in the Texas sun.
Yeah.
Got a little pink the first time and then just tan, which is the way it's supposed to work.
Right. It's how your skin's supposed to react and how we evolved with our being outside all the time and how our skin react. Yeah.
Right.
But what about lab tests? Like, do you put faith in, because this is something I check frequently and I'm curious to get your take on it, the omega-6 to omega-3 ratios, where looking at hunter-gatherer societies, looking at wild animals, the ratio is anywhere from 1 to 1 to 1 to 4 to 1 of 6 to 3s. But in the general American population now, it's like 20 to 1. So do you put much stake in those ratios and trying to correct those ratios?
Yeah, I think there's two important things that you have to realize. A lot of the research that's been done looking at omega-6 to 3 ratios, they have tried to fix the problem of too high a ratio by adding omega-3, and that typically doesn't work. And part of the reason why it doesn't work is because high levels of omega-6 block the body's ability to take up omega-3, and they also damage and break down the omega-3 fats that are in your body.
Yeah.
So the way to fix this is to lower the omega-6. Just by lowering the omega-6 will raise your body's level of omega-3s, because you don't have the collateral damage of it being broken down by the toxic omega-6 breakdown products.
Boy, that's such a great point, because there's a lot of controversy right now about omega-3 supplements, and are they beneficial? Are they helpful? And there are a number of studies that are basically null studies that show no cardiovascular benefit from omega-3s. Not all. There are some that show there are benefits, but a huge confounder is what you just said. If you're pumping omega-3s into somebody with a high omega-6 diet, you're likely not going to see the benefits for those exact reasons that you mentioned, that there's sort of competitive binding, that there's degradation involved. So that's a huge confounder. So I'm very glad you said that, because that's an important point for people to realize. Absolutely.
And that gets us back to the cardiology perspective and LDL. Why are people worried about LDL? This is an important point for people to understand. The two doctors who discovered what they call the LDL receptor, which is the pathway by which LDL is taken up into cells, were Doctors Brown and Goldstein. They received a Nobel Prize for that, right?
Right.
And the first thing that they did after discovering the LDL receptor, one of the first steps in atherosclerosis is the creation of what's called a foam cell, which is effectively a white blood cell that has been engorged with cholesterol, hence the association between cholesterol and heart disease, which then migrates into the artery wall and starts the process of an atherosclerotic plaque, which can lead to that plaque rupturing and giving you a heart attack, right? This is the whole process that we're trying to avoid here. So the first thing they did was, now we know there's an LDL receptor. We know how it gets in. We are going to take some macrophages, the fancy name for a white blood cell. We are going to incubate them in LDL, and they are going to turn into foam cells. But they didn't. Didn't
work. Whoops.
Didn't work. Oops. And there were two other doctors, Steinberg and Whitstam, who, along with some other people doing research, I have to say, the one thing you realize going through the scientific literature like this is how all these people take little bits from everybody else and connect the dots. And often, you read the studies, you go through all their footnotes, and you realize, oh, well, he made this teeny little advance, but he's standing on the shoulders of giants.
Right.
Right. So it's very important to realize there's this long, as a history buff, there's this long perspective of how these things happen. And I like to understand why these things happen because it helps you a lot. What I don't want to get into is industry caused this. No, industry didn't cause this. They thought they were doing a good thing back then, over 100 years ago. Yeah. They thought they were saving humanity.
Right.
There was no evil ulterior motive. It's just, whoops, 100 years later, Steinberg and Whitson figure out, oh, well, if LDL won't get taken up into a macrophage to turn into a foam cell, how do we make it happen? Because we know it happens. So what they discovered is you have to modify the LDL. And the modification process is oxidizing the omega-6 fats on the LDL particle. That's what makes it atherogenic. The next thing they did is they said, okay, well, we'll take some rabbits and we'll feed them 2 diets. And one diet is high in omega-6 and the other isn't. And then we will take the rabbit LDL and try and oxidize it. And sure enough, the omega-6 LDL was much more easily oxidized. Okay. So then they did the same thing in humans, found the same result. This is in the early 90s. And then entirely unrelated to these 2 gentlemen is a Dr. de Lorgeril in France who came up with this bright idea of testing something he called the Mediterranean diet. Well, what did he do in the Mediterranean diet? He lowered the omega-6 fats in the diet. He increased the omega-3 fats, and he lowered, these were all people who'd already had a heart attack.
Right.
He lowered their recurrence of a heart attack rate by 70%, which is to this day the most successful heart disease intervention trial ever. And the mechanism seems to be the lower omega-6 fats.
So that's the Lyon heart study for anybody who wants to look into that. Yeah. And very impressive. And then the sort of the follow-up study, not his, but the other Mediterranean study, which looked at primary prevention, showed, again, very impressive findings, presumably part of it from reducing omega-6, increasing omega-3s, improving that ratio. So that's the PrediMed study, the other one to sort of bookend that. Yeah, so very interesting.
But what I found interesting about this, I don't think de Lorgeril, I've gone and read through his papers, I don't think he understands the mechanism that Steinberg and Whitson found. Right?
Right.
And I know the AHA, so de Lorgeril, his control diet was the AHA, the American Heart Association, quote unquote, prudent diet. So he was testing it against what every American heart disease patient was told to eat.
Right.
Right. Now, the AHA, after he demonstrated their diet was a bit of a disaster, turned around and said, oh, that's why, if you ever wonder why the AHA is such big fans of the Mediterranean diet, it's because of this study. And they immediately changed their dietary recommendations to get more in line with his intervention.
Yet they still recommend PUFAs. They still recommend PUFAs.
Right, because I don't think they understand this basic mechanism.
Yeah.
That, I mean, if you go through and you look at the various steps of heart disease and what causes it to progress, at each step it is an oxidation product of omega-6 fats, right? That's what causes the foam cells to form. That's what causes the foam cells to migrate into the atheroma. That's what causes weird things like, why is genetic damage associated with atherosclerosis? Why would atherosclerosis cause DNA damage? Well, it's because the omega-6 breakdown products damage your DNA. And it's well known that happens. That's how they found them in the first place, because they discovered them in cancer research and then sort of started looking back, okay, where do these things come from?
But now you look over the plains of America and you see what used to be vibrant grasslands are now soybean farms and cottonseed farms and safflowers and all these this economic infrastructure directed towards producing these omega-6 oils that go into our packaged products and that go into cooking oils. And all of a sudden we're going to do a 180 and say you can't stop, or you have to stop eating these for your health. What happens to the economic infrastructure of our country? So you can see how this is not a simple solution, is it?
It's not a simple solution, but it is something that industry is very aware of the problem with omega-6 fats. And both through breeding and through genetically modifying the plants, they are increasing the level of omega-9 fats, which are oleic acid, the fat that's in olive oil. So they are very cognizant of these issues. and are actively researching, trying to reduce this problem. One of my favorite studies, I mean, it's you literally couldn't make this up as a diet person, you know. So this company makes a genetically modified soybean oil called Plenish, and they hired this scientist who had shown that soybean oil caused obesity in rodents compared to coconut oil or even sugar, which didn't, right? So what do these guys do? They hire this scientist to show that their GMO soybean oil causes less obesity than normal soybean oil. And if you go read the industry journals, they, you know, in big letters, oh, Plenish causes less obesity. Woo-hoo!
Yeah, right.
And it's just like, it makes you smack your head. It's just insane. But they do recognize that it's a problem, and they're working on trying to solve it. But yeah, to your point, you know, 7 to probably 15% of the calories that people consume in the United States are these omega-6 fats.
Yeah.
So if you turn them off tomorrow, we'd have a problem.
Right. And then what do you replace them with? Is it going to be the refined carbohydrates and the wheats and the sugars? Or is it going to be the more natural foods, the vegetables, the animal products that we were meant to consume? But anyway, that's another discussion. We've already been going for an hour, and we could probably go for another hour or two, knowing you and your background and all the information you have. But I think we do need to wrap it up.
Shouldn't subject anybody to that.
Well, we should wrap it up at this point. So last thoughts, last tips, things to leave our listeners with, and of course, where to find you if they want to hear more from you.
Yeah, I'm on, probably the best place to find me is I'm on Twitter. My handle's @TuckerGoodrich. Very simple, my name. In my profile, there's a link to my blog, which is called Yelling Stop, and I've got literally thousands of, you know, either snippets or long form articles on there. I think the biggest problem with fixing your diet like this is convenience, right? Because it basically boils down to the 3 problematic ingredients in an industrial diet are refined sugar, refined carbohydrates, and refined fats, right? That's a donut. That's junk food in a nutshell. So what this boils down to is not eating junk food. This is not revolutionary, nor should it be particularly controversial, right? Everybody knows, regardless what approach you have, that you need to eat less junk food. What I'm trying to do is quantify it to give people an understanding of why it's so important. It's not just, you know, there are mechanisms that are causing disease rates in the United States of probably north of 70% because of our bad diet. It's significant. And it's something that we as individuals need to address. And that is what's going to change it, right? The food companies are already feeling pressure to fix our food system because of the choices we are all making. We are voting with our wallets, and they are listening, and they are fixing it. So we need to understand that this process is fixable, and it is being fixed. We just have to keep going at it and accept short term. There's going to be a little inconvenience because you can't eat as much packaged food, and you may not want to eat the salad dressing all the time that you've been used to eating. There is definitely an inconvenience factor. For me personally, I have become addicted to feeling fantastic all the time.
It's a good addiction.
And I don't want to go back.
Yeah. Great message.
Yeah, it's a good addiction. And every time I go out and I go for a long run in the sun and I come back and I don't have a sunburn, I'm like, this is awesome.
All right. Fantastic message. Thank you for all the knowledge and information. Tucker Goodrich, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Pat. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Low Carb Cardiologist podcast. Please visit us on iTunes or Stitcher and click that subscribe button so you won't miss any episodes. And please take the time to leave us a review. It really helps the podcast and helps get this message out there to all those who really need to hear it to help improve their life. Also, visit us at lowcarbcardiologist.com, where you can see all our blogs, you can get access to all our free downloads, and access to my book, Your Best Health Ever. The goal is to provide as much information in as many modalities as we can to help everybody find what works for them to help them improve their health and their life. Thanks again for listening, and have a wonderful, healthy day, and we'll see you next time at the Low Carb Cardiologist.